This is Jocko Podcast number 200 with Echo Charles and me, Jocko Willink. Good evening, Echo.
Good evening.
In the morning after my swim, I sit down and have a cup of coffee and think, Jim, you're the luckiest guy in the world. And that is a quote from a man named James Sursley, a man who served his country as a soldier in the U.S. Army. So he volunteered for the Army and then volunteered to go fight in Vietnam. A man who made incredible sacrifices and who faced incredible challenges. Challenges that would overwhelm most people. And yet, he carried on. And he proved and is still proving that the human will is stronger than many of us ever realize. And that if you have the right attitude, you can look at a harrowing situation and still call it lucky. And it is an honor to have this man with us tonight to talk about his experiences and how he has overcome so much adversity. Mr. James Sursley, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here, Jocko.
Sir, honor to have you on. And I apologize that the fact that you had to travel all the way out here from sunny Florida to sunny San Diego, but I'm honored that you were able to make the trip.
I'm honored to be here. Again, thanks for asking.
And I like to start at the beginning about, just where you came from, where you grew up. And I think we're talking about Minnesota, right?
We are.
Somehow you cover up that accent pretty well.
Well, I've been living in Florida since 1971, so I'd hope I get rid of some of that.
So you grew up, what was the family situation growing up? What'd your dad do and whatnot?
My dad was a barber in Rochester, Minnesota, and my mother, for the most part, was a mother and a housewife, and worked a little bit of part-time when I got into my teenage years, along with my older sister, who was also a couple of years older than me.
And what's Rochester, Minnesota like?
Well, Rochester, Minnesota is home of the Mayo Clinic. So,
Okay.
I mean, that's the biggest thing in town, and IBM, but it's rural, southeastern corner of Minnesota. Just a great bunch of patriotic Americans is what I was accustomed to growing up.
And your dad served, if I'm correct, your dad served in the Army Air Corps?
He did. He was a radio operator on B-17s and B-24s during World War II.
Ooh. Now, how much did he talk about that when you were growing up?
Not really a whole lot. I think the biggest thing that I experienced with him was he had a Foot Locker that he brought back home, and I can remember probably as a 9 or 10-year-old kid trying to put on that stuff and have the jacket drape all over me and the pants too big and huge boots and everything else. But he never really said too much about it other than, where he experienced training in different parts of the United States and that type of thing.
And but he was you said B-17 radio operator?
And B-24s.
And
right?
B-20.
Yeah,
So,
bombers.
So was he doing the missions into Europe?
He did not do it. He never left the United States.
Okay.
Because when he finished whatever training he had, they made him a trainer of other radio operators.
Got it.
So he was lucky.
Well, yeah, otherwise there's a good chance you wouldn't even be here right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, those are the guys that were doing, if you did 25 missions, you got to go home. But there wasn't too many people that got to go home. So when you were growing up, going to high school, what was it? What were you into growing up?
Football, basketball, and baseball, and girls. I'm not sure which one was the greatest priority.
Hey, were you any good?
I was starting fullback on a football team for 3 different, sophomore, junior, and senior year. And probably could have gone to college, but I wasn't exactly the greatest student in the world, so I did make myself eligible to go on to college.
You were focused on studying female anatomy at this point?
That's correct. Yep, that'd be a good interpretation.
So So were you planning to go to college? Were you thinking about going to college? Were your parents edging you towards college?
My parents really never said too much about that. My older sister was already 2 years into college at that point. My thing was, if there had been a place where I could have gone to play football, but I didn't have to go to school, I'd have been the first one in line for that location.
Yeah.
And as I got closer to, finish school in May of 1966, and as I got into September of 66, I kind of thought about it, and I said, what I might do is I might just join the military, do 3 years in the Army, come back home, use the GI Bill, and go to school wherever I wanted to, because I knew the Army would get me a GED just about as quick as I got in there. So that was kind of some of my thoughts as I got ready to join the military.
So what year were you set to graduate from high school? Was that 1967?
No, 66.
So you
May
were
of
set,
66.
Okay, so May of 66, you started saying to yourself, all right, when I get done, I'll just join the Army.
Well, and I don't know if I even really did that. I mean, it's probably even more simple than that. I don't know whether I was a forward enough thinker to actually be in that direction. I actually drove by the post office in downtown Rochester, Minnesota. There's one of those signs that were on a spring, and it had Uncle Sam, red, white, and blue, in the big top hat, and his finger was pointed right at the windshield of my car, and it said, "Uncle Sam needs you." And I circled the block, went in and talked to the Army recruiter, not really with any great intentions of joining, but just to kind of see what that process was all about and what maybe I could do if I did join the Army.
When that recruiter saw you come through the door, he was thinking something completely different. He said, I got this guy.
Well, yeah, they were probably tremendously in need of warm bodies at that point in time during the Vietnam era, for sure.
So this is 1966. So how much were you aware of what was going on in Vietnam at this time? How much were you watching the news? How much were you seeing as far as the Vietnam War goes? Because it had definitely escalated by 1966. I mean, I had one of my friends who was a pilot in Vietnam, but he was in the Naval Academy. And 1965, they said they didn't even talk about Vietnam at the Naval Academy at all. It wasn't until they got close to the end of their senior year that they started going, oh, there's a war going on. But by 1966, it had absolutely escalated. And so what were your thoughts? Were you thinking, hey, this is, if I go in, then I know what's going to happen. I know I'm going to be going to war.
I mean, there was some discussion with fellow classmates, and I went to a parochial school, and there was a bigger public school that was there in town. And a lot of those guys were talking about, let's all go in on the buddy system, whether the Marine Corps or the Army or something. And I didn't want to have anything to do with that. I mean, that was my answer to everybody that ever raised that proposition. But we were aware of what was going on, and probably as you'd pass through the living room, your parents would have the television on. You'd see it on the 6 o'clock or the 10 o'clock news. So you knew there was activity going on, but it wasn't like it didn't scare me, but it also wasn't attractant to send me down to the Army recruiters.
So after that first visit to the Army recruiter, after Uncle Sam called you out as you drove down the street, at what point, so you go to see him, and how much longer was it before you signed the dotted line?
Well, I went home and talked to my parents about it, and it's kind of one of those things where I think they probably really focused on the news much more than I ever did. And I mean, the first thing that I mentioned about the possibility of joining the Army, my mother was in tears, I'm sure because of what you see on television. My dad, having been former member of the military, was not quite that way, but just said, hey, there's the Navy, there's the Air Force, there's a lot of different possibilities. Why don't you give that some thought? And I just kind of told them if I did join, what I thought I would want to do, and that was to be like a mechanic. That was something that I enjoyed doing on my own with vehicles and motorcycles that we had. So, I mean, I never thought about joining to be a combat soldier. And again, I probably gave myself about 2 weeks, had a little bit more discussion with my parents, and that's probably when I decided to go down and join. Again, I was 18 years old, so it wasn't like I needed permission to join. I could have done it on my own. And that's basically what I did.
So you were into cars then? Did you have your own car?
I did.
Did you have multiple cars?
Had 2 cars and a motorcycle.
And what were they?
A 1957 Chevy, a 1964 Chevy, and a Yamaha 250 motorcycle.
So and
girls. Did I mention girls?
You did a little bit, yes. And nothing about the Navy, the Marine Corps. Did they give you a contract in the Army where you were going to become a mechanic? Did they do that back then?
They did. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you knew right away, hey, you're going to go in, we're going to make you a mechanic, and that sounds like a pretty good plan.
Right.
Especially because I'm just thinking, like, when I joined the Navy, all other prospects in life didn't seem as cool as that. They didn't seem, when you said you wish there was a place where you could just go and play football, well, I wanted a place where I could just go and play commando. And there was a place like that. It was called the Navy. And that's how I ended up joining. And it seems like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not saying I didn't have any other options, but it just seemed like such a good option for me. It's so simple and straightforward. And that's actually one of the things that I liked about the Navy was when I joined, nothing else, none of my previous life mattered. It was just, here you go, here's what you have to do. So did your mind shift at all about your decision when you showed up to boot camp?
No.
Okay.
And I think really because, when I reflect on that now and look back, that there was a lot of guys who never left their hometown, never done anything when they got drafted, and I don't know, 40% of the people in my basic training unit were probably drafted, didn't want to be there, never had any intentions of being in the military. It also scared the living crap out of them. I mean, there was people that cried half the night, all night in basic training. They were away from home for the first time. They weren't physical type of people to start with, and it was just extremely difficult to watch a lot of that while I went through basic training.
Wow. So where did you go to basic training?
Fort Polk, Louisiana.
Now, were most of the kids that you went through boot camp with, did they send them, were they kids that were from that area? Did you go to boot camp like regionally, or was it people from all over the country?
People from all over the country. I think your induction and where you go for basic training in the Army at that time depended on the timing of when you got drafted or when you joined. Could have been to Fort Stewart, Georgia. I think there were places out here in California where they actually had basic. Fort Lewis, Washington had basic, all over the place. Fort Dix, New Jersey.
So you're in there with people that have been drafted. You said 40%.
I think roughly at that time, yeah.
And this is where people start doing crazy things just to get out, like, wet their bed or whatever, sleepwalk and all this kind of thing, so they just would get out of their service. Did you see that kind of thing?
We had 3 guys that actually went AWOL and stayed underneath one of those elevated wood frame World War II barracks for 3 days, because even if they'd have got out from underneath the barracks, they wouldn't have known how to get out of Louisiana to get back where they were from. So people brought them food for 3 days, and then they finally decided to surrender.
And that's the other interesting thing about this. So this is 1960. This is still 1966?
Mm-hmm.
And so the anti-war movement wasn't in full swing yet, was it? As far as just open hippies in the streets and those kind of things, that wasn't really happening in 66, was it?
No, more like 68 and 69 is when it really got cranked up.
So these kids that were coming in, they were just horrified about what was going to happen.
And I don't know whether it was even a fear of going to Vietnam, if it was just a fear of being away from home, the physicality of basic training and people screaming and hollering in your face and everything else. Man. I mean, I think that's what scared them more than anything else.
That's one thing that they can never put back in the bottle is these days, well, first of all, it's all volunteer. But second of all, we've seen, when I joined the Navy, I had seen, military boot camp movies since I was born. I mean, we just knew every little trick and anticipated everything that was going to happen. And it seems like if you were a kid from wherever and you got drafted and you'd never left home, and then you show up and you got some drill sergeant going nuts in your face, yeah, that's totally different. That's a shock to the system.
And that was before you could play that card, I guess, that they use now. There's a timeout card in a lot of different branches of the military. where you can go over and make a phone call and call your congressman if you want. If you're being mistreated, you can call home and report